On paper, the original Guacamelee should have been one of my favourite things ever. It combined one of my favourite types of game, the Metroidvania, with one of my biggest non-gaming related passions, wrestling, Lucha Libre specifically. And while I did enjoy it, the game fell just a little short of greatness for me. Now in the middle of 2018's torrent of Metroidvania-style indie games, Guacamelee 2 looks to cement itself as a champion among its peers. So is it a winner? Let's take a look. Guacamelee 2 takes place 7 years after the original, where the game's hero, Juan, prevented the merging of the worlds of the living and the dead. Now Juan is retired from the hero business and has settled down with his wife, his 2 kids, and his casual dad bod. But Juan is forced to don the mask once more as huge tears in space and time begin to appear in the sky, caused by a convergence of mystical relics in an alternate universe referred to as the Darkest Timeline. Without going into too much detail, Guacamelee 2's story is a fairly big improvement over that of the original. Where the original was a pretty entertaining riff-off of the usual save the princess trope, Guacamelee 2 feels a lot more interesting, if only because this foray into alternate histories allows for some deeper exploration of the game's world and characters. We get to see how characters we grew to love from the first game exist in a world where Juan failed, as well as getting to go up against a brand new set of memorable villains. Beyond the actual plot, I feel like the game's writing hits a better comedic balance as well. It's funny, but not overbearing with its silliness. Speaking of which, the game has also cut down on the environmental memes a lot, which was one of my biggest gripes with the original. Now there are just lots of Lucha morphed references to various pop culture icons scattered around the environment, and these are generally worthy of a sensible chuckle here and there. Beyond these little references, the game's environments come to life with vibrant colours and a unique, angular art style. There's a decent variety on display when it comes to Guacamelee 2's locations as well, as you'll be exploring swamps, temples, and even hell itself, and each of these massive zones have a living and dead world variation, complete with an entirely different colour scheme for each. From a visual standpoint, one of the weirdest improvements that stuck out to me was the splash art for unlocking new abilities. They're much more visually striking than those found in Guacamelee 1, and the music that accompanies them makes it feel like a fiesta every time you unlock something. Actually, the sound design overall is pretty perfect. Upbeat mariachi-style themes with synth and digitized flourishes accompany most of your journey throughout the Mexiverse, with the electronic elements coming to the forefront when you swap from the living world to the world of the dead. On top of all that, the punchy sound effects that accompany the game's constant lucha-flavored combat are super satisfying, which is good, because you will be fighting a lot of things in this game. Guacamelee 2 may be a Metroidvania style game, but it leans way more heavily into the action part of this action exploration genre. While the platforming and exploration elements are still satisfying and well-rounded, it's Guacamelee 2's combat that gets the most game time, and thankfully it's fast, fun, and challenging for the duration of the game. At its core, the game's combat is simple, with one button for attacks, one for grapples, and one for dodging, but complexity is added throughout Guacamelee 2's runtime through the introduction of new enemies and mechanics. For the most part, these are returning ideas. There are a number of brand new enemy types, but the gradual introduction of enemies with move-specific shields, or enemies who can't be attacked unless you're in the correct world, are holdovers from the first game. To the game's credit, it does add another 2 attack abilities to Juan's repertoire, allowing for a little bit more variety in terms of the combat challenges that Guacamelee 2 can throw at you. Much like the last game, the special abilities serve double duty, as they function as both super attacks like body slams and uppercuts, and traversal maneuvers for reaching new areas. Their most immediate function outside of combat is to break barriers that lock off later areas of the game, but some of the more challenging platforming puzzles require you to chain certain special moves together to gain a longer or taller jump. While Juan isn't overly mobile at the beginning of the game, by the end you'll be wall jumping, double jumping, dash punching, uppercutting, and even flying through the air, and this is only while you're human. When it comes to platforming, and more specifically the abilities that spice up that platforming, Guacamelee 2 adds a lot more to do in Juan's chicken form. This skill was a little underdeveloped in the first game, but now, on top of actually being effective in combat, chicken form also has access to new traversal skills that diversify the platforming sections, and allow for new progression blocks to pique your curiosity. Despite Guacamelee 2's heavy bent towards combat, I found that platforming to be where the game really amped up the challenge. While some fights could be pretty hairy, none ever compared to the tougher optional challenges that awarded you with extra stamina or health. These often require precision timing as well as smart use of any number of your abilities, and while they are hard as hell, I never found them to feel impossible. The difficulty came from my inability to wrap my head around the order of the skills required, not the controls themselves. And even when you do die, your checkpoints are fairly generous, and the speed with which you restart is practically inconsequential. Guacamelee 2 wants you to get back into the action as soon as possible. And honestly, the action is fast and addictive, so even if you do find yourself dying over and over again, you'll find that the game is too difficult to put down. Adding to its addictive nature are the newly added skill trees. These give you a good incentive to not only keep playing, but also to switch up your playstyle, as certain upgrades are locked until you meet their specific requirements. Capping it all off, the game not only has a decent amount of optional upgrades to track down, it also has 4-player drop-in, drop-out co-op, which, despite the potential for coordination frustration, is another fun way to play this already top-notch game. My only real gripe with the game is that, for the most part, Guacamelee 2's boss fights are kinda forgettable. The villains themselves are fun as characters, but aside from the final boss and one secret boss, I didn't find myself having to up my game when these progression blockers came around. A good boss fight serves as a final exam for all the skills you've learnt up until that point, and while the fights do utilise the skills that the game teaches you along the way, you hardly need to master them to proceed. It's a little underwhelming. With all that said, Guacamelee 2 is excellent. Its combat is fast and satisfying, the platforming is challenging and varied, and the world of Guacamelee 2 is just a joy to spend hours and hours in. It's very rare that I'll go so far as to 100% complete a game for review, but Guacamelee 2 just had me so absolutely hooked. Fans of the first game should expect a tighter, funnier, and more diverse experience, and people who just want a fast and fun Metroidvania could do much, much worse.